Hi, my name is Christian Straussner, and today I'll be covering Chapter 32, Legacies of Imperialism. So, primarily today I'll be speaking upon the empires of economy, first and foremost. So, first we see that the principal motives of imperialism is the desire to gain access to natural resources and agricultural products. We also see that reorganization of subject societies to become efficient suppliers of material products is also very important in this time period, as well as trade advantages, which led colonial powers to encourage subject lands to provide raw material for processing in other industrial societies around the globe. First and foremost, we have economic changes within this section. We see that colonial rule transformed production of crops and commodities, and so colonial administrators reoriented the cultivation of cotton to serve the needs of the emerging British textile industry. Ministers also encouraged cultivators to produce cotton for exports rather than just local consumption, and that infrastructure was built, obviously mainly on most of those railroads to ship raw cotton from the interior to the coast. And so raw cotton was also shipped to England, where most of these factories were then transformed such materials into high quality textiles. We also see that the value of raw cotton at the time from these exports from India to England grew immensely from 1849 to the early 1920s. In addition, the value of the amount of imported finished textiles from England to India also grew exponentially, showing how trade can benefit both parties. Next, we have more so social changes. So, colonial rule changed the physical landscape and social order. In so, vegetation that was in previous form were routinely removed to make way for new crops, seeing that rainforests were down slash removed in a way to make so for these crops. And in socialization, we see that women were recruited en masse to harvest even tea leaves in certain countries. And in so, the increase in certain crops like these tea leaves made it more available to a wider population in Europe. So not only was the tea leaves a societal driving force during the colonial period, but another cash crop such as rubber as well had a transformative effect on the countries that were able to provide in the European continent in much as the same way as the tea had done in India and Europe. Next, we have labor migrations, a very, very important subject in this chapter. We see it's labor migrations was considered to be the efforts generated towards the exploitation of natural resources and agricultural products of subject land. So we see that this led to encourage both imperial and colonial powers to the mass of migrations of workers within the 18th and 19th century. Two patterns that we primarily see in this section is European migration and indentured labor migrations, and I'll talk about more of that in the next upcoming slides. However, both groups profoundly influenced the development of societies in both the American and Pacific basins. First, in my labor migrations, I want to talk about European migration specifically. So, within the 1800 and 1914 time range, we see well over 50 million European migrants abandon their homes in order to seek new opportunities. We see most of these migrants during this time period were relatively from poor agriculture populations from southern and eastern Europe, countries primarily like Russia, Italy, and Poland. Later on, not so poor of countries, but more so involved in this scenario. We see Britain, Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia. And then well over 50% of the 50 million, we have 32 million migrants located to the United States itself. A considerable portion of these early migrants had explored primarily for cheap land cultivation, settling heavily in the northeast region of the United States, and provided labor that drove the U.S. industrialization in 1860. Countries such as Canada, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa drew a large number of European migrants who became the first cultivators, herders, and skilled laborers in mines of fledgling industries. Some traveled as free agents, but others were served as indentured laborers. So we see that these groups were able to seek opportunities in temperate regions due to European and Euro-American imperialism in in the Americas and South Africa and oceanic regions. Next, we have the indentured labor migration. So, touching on that, most of these individuals originated from the Asia, Africa, and Pacific island nations, who are also referred to as slaves. Most of us obviously know what slaves is. It's a very touchy subject, but we know what it refers to as. So, we know a slave was slowly diminished and laborers took place, often working transport to see these countries in exchange for minimal wages and living conditions. So, for these laborers are working between 5 and 7 years, um, you know, originate from relatively poor countries such as China, Japan, Africa, and Pacific Islands, as stated before, and they worked on plantations, cultivating, materials such as tea, rubber, sugar, as well as other, major industries in the railroads in the United States, for gold mines in South Africa. And we also see these laborers came from a number of different poor countries and uh, hope of earning a living to help richer countries increase their industries and select, you know, commodities. And then lastly, for labor migrations, we have empire migration. So a large scale of migrations in the 1800s were a result of the influence and economic strength of the imperial and colonial powers. Primarily, European and American migrations occurred to more temperate locations where early settlers had already been located. Specifically, indentured laborers were immigrated and sent to locations where colonial powers had already created plantations for them to work on. These mass migrations of large numbers of workers were substantially transformed the societies where they went because they took the cultural and ethnic tendencies to new lands. This effect kind of translated into the colonial effect. So we see that policies adopted by imperial powers and colonial officials forced individuals from various social backgrounds to deal with one another in a systematic basis. So a lot of these interactions led to violent conflicts between colonized and subjected people, and which often, resulted in rebellions. So two of the more prominent rebellions that resisted British and German colonial authority in India specifically was the Sepoy and Maji Maji rebellion. Rebellions often drew strength from traditional religious beliefs and were led by priests or prophets, very religious figures. Rebellions served as a major constant threat to colonial rule during this time period. And colonial powers also led to conflicts among people who were brought together artificially in multicultural societies. So we see that linguistic, cultural, and religious differences provided a foundation for strong ethnic identities. Um, Going into further kind of the more of academic venture, we see scientific racism. So social and cultural differences were considered to be the foundation of academic pursuit during the 1840s. One of the leading founders of this sort of movement was the Count Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, from 1860 to 1882, who saw race as the most important index of human potential. From the 19th century, theorists assumed that most human species consisted of several distinct racial groups. In one of his writings entitled The Inequality of Human Races, Gobineau divided humanity into four main racial groups, each of which had its own particular or peculiar traits. Obviously, it had its racist type factors, but eventually in the 19th and 20th century, racist thinkers based racial groups off of skin color, and then biologically going into bone structure, nose shape, cranial capacity, and many other physical characteristics, which dives me into the works of Charles Darwin, who was an English biologist who argued that all living species had developed over thousands of years in constant survival of those who adapted and survived would then flourish within their environment. We see that the individual would then take such ideas um, and develop them into their own theories explaining the development and structure of the human society. So taking that work of Charles Darwin and putting into a further context, which doesn't make too much sense, and kind of gets into the work of Herbert Spencer, who was an English philosopher who relied on the theories of evolution to explain significant differences between the strong and the weak, such as successful individuals and races had competed better in the natural world and constantly evolved to higher states than did others. So less fit people, describing taking correlations of biological factors and tying into just facts that just did not make sense. And lastly, for this empires and societies, we have popular racism. So representatives of both imperial and colonial powers adopted racist views on the basis of personal experience. And particularly in 1986, colonial France's young husband reflected on the difference between peoples that he had noticed during his travels throughout Asia. And India, particularly. He made statements regarding race, intelligence, purity, and tried to correlate such matters on the subjects to a biological standard between a multitude of races. This would later be tied into going to general history, so such as U.S. and Japan matters, and develop a sense of superior over the peoples that they conquered and ruled, specifically the U.S. forces in the Philippines who had tortured their enemies in a matter to civilize and Christianize their individuals, and also can be correlated to the indigenous endeavors with colonial powers during the 1700s to 1800s. Next, we have the national and anti-colonial movement. So, colonial rule provoked a multitude of subjects and peoples to develop a sense of their own identities, such as imperial expansion and colonial domination ensued the creation of national identities and the organization of anti-colonial movements in foreign subject landscapes. So, we see that the potential of imperialism and colonial to push subjects, people towards nationalism, was the most evident in India. One of these individuals that was most influential in India was Ram Mohan Roy from 1772 to 1833. Mohan Roy was a prominent Bengali intellectual, sometimes called the father of modern India, was part of a educated Indian elite who helped forge a sense of Indian identity. He also argued for the construction of a society based on the modern European science and the Indian judicial devotional of Hinduism. Supported British colonial policies and also gave forth a campaign to end the practice of sati and worked with Christian social reformers to improve the status of women, providing them with educational and property rights. He also envisioned himself as a Hindu reformer who drew from inspiration from Vedas and Upanishads and who sought to bring Hindu, that spirituality on most of these problems that was pushed back from reform and the conditions of his own time. He then took this work and published them into newspapers and founded societies to mobilize educated Hindus and advance the cause of social reform in colonial India. Later on in the mid-century, we see that reformers increasingly called for self-government and at least greater Indian participation in the government itself. Thus, we have the Indian National Congress. Founded in 1855, we see the Indian National Congress served as a form of education for educated Indians to communicate their views on public affairs and colonial officials. Specifically, representatives from all parts of the subcontinent discussed issues regarding Indian poverty, the transfer of wealth from Indian to Britain, trade and tariff policies to businesses, the inability of colonial officials to provide effective relief for regions stricken by drought and famine, and British racism towards Indians. The timeline is a little bit skewed, but we see in 1909 the colonial authorities granted a limited franchise that allowed wealthy Indians to elect representatives of local legislative councils. Then in 1916, Congress joined forces with all Indian Muslim League to the most prominent organizations working to advance the political and social interests of Muslims, which made roughly up of 25% of the Indian population. Thus, later in the 12th century, Indian nationalism became a powerful movement that would then bring independence to colonial rule. And then overarchingly, we see that the Congress had openly sought Indian self-rule within a larger imperial framework. And here is a picture of the origin of Indian National Congress. I thought it was kind of interesting. It was a newspaper article that I'd found. Thought it'd be a little bit interesting to see firsthand what it looked like. But I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and thank you.